Hello and welcome to Adventures. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my journeys and expeditions from over the years, and I'm going to try to translate them into some kind of perspective in relation to how we're living now. I'm going to start at the beginning of my career when I was marooned for a year on the island of Castaway in the Outer Hebrides. It was 1999, the eve of the millennium, and the BBC wanted to celebrate the year with a groundbreaking social experiment. Reality TV was born. Up until that moment, reality TV as we know it now didn't exist. The notion of taking people out of their natural environment and putting them in an artificial one for them was entirely new. I'd argue reality TV has changed beyond all recognition in the 20 years since. In fact, reality TV has now become unreality TV. Today, 20 years on, it's heavily scripted and produced. TV folk want to know the start, the middle and the end before it's even begun. But back then, it had a real naivety and innocence to it. And we, the volunteers, were the guinea pigs of this whole new type of television. Perhaps because of the fact that reality TV didn't exist at that moment, none of us went there for fame and fortune. We didn't go there to become caricatures of ourselves. We went there for very simple, humble, organic reasons. We went there to become farmers, to learn new skills, to be Robinson Crusoes, to grow beards, to have an adventure. And it really was one of the greatest adventures of my life. I'll never forget Boxing Day 1999 when we got on a coach at Victoria Coach Station in central London, and we made that very long journey all the way up to Scotland and then out to the Western Isles. And eventually boats and helicopters, as the weather deteriorated, dropped us all on that beach in the Outer Hebrides on the island of Castaway. And then they disappeared. And there we were, 36 men, women and children. A lot of people forget that there were young children on that island, 8 in total. Youngest was 2. The oldest castaway was in their 70s. We really were a cross-section of society. But there we were, the 36 of us on that beach. The boats, the helicopters disappeared and we were left. Can you imagine the silence, the fear, the trepidation? We had 12 months ahead of us. We had a huge pile of equipment. Shortly before we went, we all met up in the Lake District to discuss what we would need for the year ahead. We were given a budget, and with it, we could buy the water piping, the fencing, the crops, the polytunnels, the building materials for the pods that we would live in. And there it was next to us, this mountain, this metaphorical Everest of equipment. And that was the first moment in my life when the journey ahead seemed impossible. I couldn't get my head around how we were even going to start. You know when you have a very cluttered room, or your head is so cluttered with ideas and sentiments, it's almost impossible to wade through it. It's like a syrup. And that was my first experience of this overwhelming mountain that lay ahead of us. It felt impossible, if I'm to be honest. And that loud voice, that little man on my shoulder, that little devil was telling me, you're never going to make it through this. I was already missing home. We had huge storms. In fact, in those first few days, 100-mile-an-hour winds ripped across the island. The children were so small compared to the winds that we actually had to give them little tethers, and we put down rope along the walkways between the very simple structures that we already had to stop them being blown off the island. And we had to work out where we were going to start. And that was the first experience that I'd ever had of mind control, of controlling this, keeping that cloud of anxiety and despondency, depression, I suppose, away, and focusing on what we could do, trying to harness optimism and hope over pessimism and despair. And we worked together as a community. The key to that whole Castaway experience really was community. We never elected a leader. It was quite controversial. I think the BBC was very hopeful that we would elect a president, a prime minister, a king or queen of that island. But we never did. The result was endless meetings. But in those first early days of forming, we were getting to know one another, it was actually quite a happy place, if I'm to be honest. We all had tasks. First of all, we had to get our living accommodation sorted. We converted an old animal shed called a steading, and we built a kitchen in it. We had a room where we could socialize, where we could shelter. We built some simple showers and bathrooms there. And once we had that, we started to assemble those bricks. And once you've got the first layers, the foundations in, everything becomes a little bit simpler. I think generally most of us are creatures of habit. We love consistency. Now, I'm the person that spends up to 9 months of my life traveling around the world. For me, variety is the spice of life, but I still like knowing a sort of routine. I like knowing what I'm going to have for breakfast in the morning. I like knowing when I'm likely to get some exercise. I like knowing when I can communicate with my family. And if we put that into perspective with how we're living now, we've been thrown into chaos. The normality has become extraordinary. None of us have the consistency we once had of being able to go out whenever we want, of being able to exercise when we want, of being able to go to work when we want. And I think it's that abnormality that so many people are struggling with. People are becoming overwhelmed with anxiety and fear because of the unknown. But once we can turn the extraordinary into the ordinary, that's when you start to control the narrative in your head. That's when you start to reclaim hope and optimism. That's when a smile returns to your face. And over those first few days, we worked together as hard as we could. We had to find the materials to build the shelters for the animals. We had cows, we had pigs, we had sheep, we had chickens on the island. And once we started to build up an infrastructure, things became so much easier. And of course, we started to develop a routine. We each had tasks. I had a number of different tasks. One was milking duty. I used to love that. I'd get up at 6 o'clock each morning. We had 3 cows to milk in total. And I can still remember Angel was one of our cows, having my forehead pressed against her side. There was something really reassuring about that. And hand milking into a bucket, squirt, squirt, and then I had a dog, Inca, with me, 1 squirt into her mouth. I'd have a cup of tea, and when I wanted some milk into that, I'd squirt it into the cup. And there was something rather thrilling about the just how different life had suddenly become. I was also on bread making duty. I became a bit of a bread master. I'm not sure that I could win Bake Off, but I could give it a good go. And I used to love just this complete abnormal routine. And once I started to get used to the fact that I didn't have communications, we were cut off from the outside world. There were no phones, there was no internet, there was no TV, there was no newspapers, there were no visitors. It was just the 36 of us. I started to thrive. We started to get to know one another. And then we could escalate the tasks that we had to do. We erected the polytunnels, we started growing crops. We're really lucky here now in our isolation. We have a garden, and I've spent the last week turning over some of the grass to a vegetable patch. We've managed to get hold of some seeds, and we're starting to plant up with cucumbers and potatoes and tomatoes. And there's something really reassuring about reclaiming control of the narrative. You see, if we look at pre-corona isolation and post-corona isolation, we have very different sentiments. Pre-isolation, we were entirely dependent. Most of us, I'm being very sweeping with my sentiments here, but most of us had a dependency culture. We entirely depended on supermarkets. We entirely depended on the monetary system. We entirely depended on outside help when it came to plumbing or electrics or building work. We had a complete dependency. And I think that's one of the reasons why some people feel so fearful, because when you're in your house and you can't go out except to do a little bit of minimal exercise or to go and visit the supermarket, it's almost like we're handcuffed. What if? There are so many what ifs going on in your mind. And on that island, I can remember thinking every single day, What if someone becomes injured? What if we break a leg? What if one of the animals becomes injured? What if we can't get water flowing? What if we run out of driftwood to burn as fuel to heat our food? There were so many what ifs, but once you have an answer, once you reassure yourself that you can that you can be resourceful on your own terms, it changes the whole mood of your mind. And that fear and darkness that can sometimes cloud your head, and believe me, I'm just as susceptible to that as anyone else, everything starts to become a little bit easier. And on that island, once we realized that yes, we could plant these crops, yes, we were able to put in 2 miles of water piping and carry it ourselves up to one of the little lochs on the island. Can you imagine that? We had 2 miles of heavy water piping that had been flown in by helicopter. And then we, without any machinery, without any vehicles, we had to haul that all the way up one of the mountains. And I remember thinking, this is never going to work. And then wondering how on earth we were going to prime that water. How were we going to get the water pressure into the pipe? It wasn't like you could suck on a pipe that was 6 inches in diameter, but we worked it out. We worked it out as a team. And one of the most thrilling moments I ever had on that island was when we got the water piping to a loch about 2 kilometers away from our little community. And we had to come up with a way of getting enough pressure in it. And we came up with the idea of dumping about 100 meters of this piping into the loch and filling it with water. So we had to get into the loch, freezing cold. We had to hold it underwater and make sure that we flooded it. And then a group of about 10 of us hauled it out of the loch and quickly tied it together. And the weight of that water, can you see the smile on my face just thinking back to it? It almost makes me cry thinking how beautiful that moment was. The weight of that 100 meters of water in the pipe was enough to send the water shooting down to our little community, and we finally had as much fresh water as we would possibly need. And it was one of the most thrilling, exciting moments I ever experienced there, and it changed the whole dynamic. Suddenly things became possible. The impossible became possible. And if we take that to a parallel of how we're living now, we have to be more resourceful, we have to be more resilient, we have to be more careful with how we consume. And I think slowly now, 2 weeks into isolation, perhaps 3 weeks, I've got no idea what day it is, let alone how long we've been in isolation. But I think a lot of us are finally starting to adapt to this new routine. And the key is there are so many moments in my life when I've wished it away. Now, of course, none of us want to stay in isolation. The economy needs us to get out there. We need it for our mental welfare. We need to create vaccines. We need the scientists to keep working. It's in everyone's interest to get the country started again. But don't wish this moment away. This is the opportunity when you can do all those things you had always wanted to do. The book that you'd wanted to write, the painting you'd wished that you had time to do, the renovations in the house, the time spent with your children, teaching them the tasks that you never got round to doing. Now is the chance to do all those things that you always wished you had time to do. But first of all, you have to clear your mind, because it's very easy to obsess about other things. Now, many people are worried about economics. People have lost their jobs. People are worried about their health and well-being. People are worried about their relatives. But if you can start to control this, and you can start to break your day up into manageable sizes, give yourself a task, give yourself a carrot, then it's amazing how suddenly you can become more creative. There's a sentiment that actually boredom creates huge creativity. Me doing little videos like this, I've never had time to do them in my life. I have requisitioned my children's treehouse, so thank you, Ludo and Iona, for letting me have this little office space over the next few weeks for a couple of hours each day to be able to share these some of my own experiences with all of you. And I think the key is resourcefulness and creativity. It's certainly something that I have found has happened to me in all the different environments that I've experienced over the years. But living on that island taught me so many lessons. I did learn to cope with boredom. Shortly before we went on that island, the producers allowed us each to take one luxury item. Someone took a home brewing kit, very sensible. I think a lot of home brewing will be starting up right now. I've certainly started my own. Someone else took a piano. But for me, there was never a question of what I would take as my luxury item. I took a dog. I'm the son of a vet. I always wanted to be a vet myself. I failed all of my exams, so that was never going to happen. But I've always loved animals, great and small, dogs in particular. So I took a little Labrador puppy, and she became my loyal companion, my best friend for 13 years. Inca was her name. And she was such a great distractor. Taking her out for a walk, hugging her. She was calming and soothing. And I'm not for one moment suggesting you all go out and get dogs. Dogs are for life, not just for Corona. But having a distraction, whatever that may be, whether it's the painting that you suddenly start doing or that book that you start writing, can be surprisingly reassuring. It was amazing to see the progression of our community. There was no voting off, incidentally. A lot of people still describe me as the winner of Castaway. I was not the winner. There was no winner. There was no prize money. There was no voting off. There was no audience interaction. There were no presenters on the island. It was just the 36 of us. And if anything, the idea, the objective was to try and keep as many of us on that island as possible over the year. The idea was to create a happy community. I've often thought it was actually misnamed. It was called Castaway. We were on an island, off another island in the Western Isles of Scotland. It was remote, but we could see the island opposite. I can remember sitting on the shore, looking at the beach, maybe a mile across the ocean, and seeing dog walkers in the distance, wondering what their lives were like. I've always thought that ours was more about community, and now, today, more than ever, community is crucial. So many of us are isolated from our loved ones. We're on our own. I'm lucky I'm here with my immediate family, Marina, Ludo and Iona, but I haven't seen my parents. And the most important thing is communication. We didn't have that on Tarrantay, but we communicated with one another. We became entirely dependent, and with that dependency came great friendships. We really did forge friendships for life on that island. But to bring it back to the now and how we're living in isolation, don't lose contact with your loved ones. It's so important to reach out, not physically, but we can digitally. We didn't have any technology like this on that island, but it's very easy to leave a little postcard or a post-it note on your neighbour's door, on their window, perhaps set up a WhatsApp group within your local community. I know that people across the country have done this. And for me, if there is one silver lining to this awful crisis that the whole world is experiencing, it's the rebirth of community. I've experienced the beauty of community all around the world with so many journeys and experiences I've had since that year on Tarrantay. But for me, Tarrantay really was all about the community. We took turns teaching the children in the schoolhouse. We built a little schoolhouse. I helped with PE. I was no Joe Wicks. That's why you don't see me strutting my stuff right now. I helped with drama. I'm the son of an actress as well, so there is a theatrical side to me. And I loved spending time with the children. And it was almost like turning down the speed of life. I think pre-corona, we all lived at speed 9 out of 10. We wanted everything like that. We lived an instant gratification society, the X Factor society, where you want instant gratification at the click of those fingers. And on the island of Tarrantay for a year, we were forced to slow down. I've often described it as the slow life. And in some ways, that is how we are all living now. We have adapted and adopted a much slower pace of life. We're forced to by the nature of how we live. We simply can't live as hastily and speedily as we did before. And I can't reiterate enough how good that is for mental welfare. This is the time to catch up on all that sleep that you haven't had. Living on that island, we almost adopted a sleep according to daylight pattern. In the winter, we slept much longer. We didn't really wake up until daybreak, which in the Outer Hebrides could be quite late in the winter season. And in the summer, we would wake up super, super early. A handful of people left that island over the year. There were about 6 or 7, and they all left for their own very personal reasons. But I stayed for the duration, and I think to date it remains one of the most extraordinary, life-changing experiences of my life. My confidence grew. I learned all sorts of new skills. I became much more resourceful, and most importantly, I became much more respectful. And again, if we're to bring it back to how we're all living now, I think we've all been a little bit humbled by this whole experience. I think we've become much more respectful of people we took for granted. Think how much we admire all those doctors and nurses and cleaners, every single person, the scientists, the researchers, all those people who are on the front line now, who we just took for granted. It's so easy to become accustomed to what happens around you. And it's one of the reasons that in the years since being marooned on that island, I have continued to push my own boundaries to avoid complacency. Well, all of our lives have been shaken to their very core over the last few weeks, and we've been reminded of the complacency that we had developed as a nation and as a world. We had become accustomed to the ease of getting whatever we wanted, whenever we wanted. And we're now suddenly realizing the value of the simplest things. Loo paper, fresh bread, flour. We haven't been able to get flour from the supermarket for weeks and weeks. And you suddenly start to realize just how lucky we were and how lucky we are to have these great nurses, to have these great doctors, to have these great researchers and scientists and carers and ambulance drivers and police and army folk who are on our new front line. And all we're being asked to do is stay at home. And you can't really ask for much more than that. Can you imagine what it was like after 12 months leaving that island? The psychologist Cynthia McVeigh, who followed the project, described it like a bereavement. It was one of the saddest experiences, despite the fact I couldn't wait to leave that island, the artificial incarceration of that island. I couldn't wait to see my family again, to see my friends again, to have freedom, to get in a car, to be able to walk on a beach with other people, to be able to go to the shops. All of those things had been deprived. I'd been deprived of them for a whole year, and suddenly I had them again. And yet I remember crying with sadness that I was leaving the beauty and the simplicity of that island and everything that had become normal in my life. And it shook me to the core. It was almost like a reverse culture shock. Suddenly everything was overwhelming. The noises, the smell, everything was too fast. But true to form, I adapted back to what had now become reality from the reality show. And that year was the start of, I suppose, the building block of a whole series of adventures that I've used to build my confidence, to build my self-esteem, but also to build on the foundations of actually finding things that make me a humbler, make me a more resourceful, and make me a more respectful individual. I fell in love with nature, I fell in love with the environment, and I also became fascinated by people. I became fascinated by other people's stories, by other people's personalities. And I don't think life will ever be the same since I lived on that island. The great irony is that I always thought that in the event of a worldwide crisis, if everything went wrong, that would be my destination. That's where I would escape to with my family. And now I'm isolated here in my children's treehouse, isolated from the isolation of the Outer Hebrides. You never know how life is going to turn out, but you get out of it what you put into it. And you can control your own narrative. You can control your own mood. You can control the optimism and hope and happiness and kindness that you project on others. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Over the next few days, I'll be bringing you some other adventures. Next adventure will be rowing across the Atlantic, and hopefully I will be sharing some more of my own practical experiences of mind control and of how to unearth the happiness that lies within all of us. I hope you've enjoyed today's adventures. Namaste.